Caroline Hurford from the World Food Programme, thank you for talking to us. It's been 6 months since famine was declared in parts of central and southern Somalia. Could you give us an update on the situation in Somalia and in the rest of the Horn?
The situation is still giving us cause for concern, and the World Food Programme is still trying to reach approximately 1.3 million people in Somalia. Although we feel that we have averted catastrophe in much of the area, we've actually saved lives in all 5 countries that were affected by this dreadful drought last year. We've saved approximately 8 million people as a result of our efforts. However, we would press the donor community to continue to support us because the situation is extremely fragile, and while we wait for the next harvest, we know that there are many people who could slip through into a pretty desperate state.
What effect has the Kenyan invasion of southern Somalia had on relief efforts and the drought in general?
Well, there is a difficulty, of course, on the border with Kenya and Somalia at the Dadaab refugee camp. There are increasing tensions in the region, and it's become much more dangerous for staff to work there, and indeed for the 450,000 refugees who we're trying to assist in the region. So this has certainly complicated the situation on the border, and I believe that fewer Somalis are coming across the border because Kenya closed that border sometime late last year.
Could you comment on the report released yesterday, January 18th, by Oxfam called A Dangerous Delay, about the delays in funding for relief agencies in the drought?
Well, it isn't just the delay in the funding. In fact, we agree with the report, certainly its findings, because there was a dangerous delay. And although we in the World Food Programme had actually started to raise the alarm back in November 2010, when we saw that progressive droughts had hit the region and therefore the harvests were well down on what they should have been, we started to ring the alarm bell, but unfortunately donors didn't come forward. And even as late as June in Somalia, we were cutting rations because we were so drastically underfunded. So it was a great challenge to us to raise the resources to be able to respond adequately to this crisis. And as I said, I think we would agree with most of the findings in the Oxfam Save the Children report. We acknowledge that on the most part, donor governments were not prepared to take our word for it that there was a risk, a serious risk of severe hunger across the region. And if they had come in sooner, then I feel that we would have been able to do even more. But as it was, we saved approximately 8 million lives, as it were, and we know that we have done all that we could, but we were essentially faced with the difficulty of scaling up quickly once the famine, as you say, was declared in July of last year.
You're now warning about a potential crisis in the Western Sahel, Niger, Mali, Chad. What can be done to draw attention to the problem?
I think we have this report about the Horn of Africa crisis to thank for the fact that attention is now being drawn across the other side of the continent to the Sahel, which is now suffering its 3rd drought in a decade. And this is hitting countries such as Niger particularly hard because people simply haven't had the opportunity to recover since the drought of 2010 and previous to that in 2005. We are scaling up our efforts. We are providing supplementary food for mothers and children in particular, because we know that it's the children who are especially vulnerable when there isn't enough food around, or when people can't afford to buy it, because the problem is that the food that is available is way beyond the price that most people can pay. And there are a whole mixture of factors which have come into this. In Niger in particular, we've had locusts, so the harvest just has been well down on previous years and on the 5-year average. And of course there have been other effects like migrant workers returning from Libya, say, and that's made an extra burden on people who are already struggling to find enough to eat.
And how are you raising this much needed money from the international donor community?
Well, for the World Food Programme, we're still hoping that they will respond more generously. We know that the European Union have already doubled their donation contribution to the region, which we're very grateful for. Of course, it's not all coming to the World Food Programme, but we, alongside our fellow NGOs, will be very grateful for that. However, we're still approximately only half funded for Niger. Some of the other countries, we're working together with the governments, for instance, in Mauritania and Mali, and some other countries, Burkina Faso, for instance, they still need to tell us exactly what they want from the international community. But we're standing by, and we hope that with the right foods at the right time, we will be able to come to their assistance.
What needs to be done right now?
We really need to get hold of as much food locally, regionally, as we can. We need to buy that food, we need the money to do so, and then we will be moving out through the countries into the regions which have been hardest hit. In the case of Niger, it's Tillabéri and Maradi. And we know that once we've got the children eating this plumpy sup, which is essentially a very nutritious peanut paste, we know that we can keep them from falling over into the severely malnourished state, which provokes the television pictures, which then also produces the reaction amongst the giving public. But we don't want it to get to that state. If we work quickly now, we can avert the catastrophe that we saw in the Horn of Africa.
Could you tell us more about what the WFP is doing in Niger?
The World Food Programme realises that if we take swift action now, and if the donors respond to our appeals, we can avert the same kind of catastrophe that we saw looming in the Horn of Africa. We know that if we get to people quickly enough, we can save them from the general acute malnutrition which they will otherwise suffer from. We've already had the assessments coming in from the government showing that already the general acute malnutrition rate is 5% above the emergency threshold. That's 20% of people in Niger. We know that this is the epicenter, but we shouldn't forget that there are other neighboring countries which are also suffering from the same drought, which has affected the region for the third time in a decade.
Could you tell us more about the cash transfers you're providing for at-risk populations in Niger?
The World Food Programme is looking into various options of coping with this particular disaster which is looming. And it's not just the general food distributions, although those are very important for people who find themselves severely food insecure. But we're also looking at the possibility, and indeed carrying out, food and cash transfers so that people can buy whatever food there is on the markets, and they have the choice to purchase what they want. And we've found that this is a good idea to help people to repair their livelihoods, amongst other things, either to build up a small stock of animals or to buy the food to eat. So this has affected more than 100,000 people across Niger itself.
Does this recognise the role that rising global food prices are having on food insecurity across the region?
The high food prices are definitely one of the major factors, besides pests and drought, which have actually caused this particular food crisis in the Sahel region. We also have seen that there's been what's called a dash for maize. People have been going as far as Côte d'Ivoire in order to find maize to buy. And in fact, the general harvest has been so low across the region, in many cases, governments just haven't been able to buy all that much locally in order to support their own people.
Once again, we're seeing the WFP and other aid agencies being forced to firefight, moving from one crisis on to the next. What does the World Food Programme do to build up long-term resilience to prevent or at least lessen the frequency of these crises?
Many of the countries that we're talking about, whether it's in the Sahel or in the Horn of Africa, are basically food insecure for much of the time. And therefore, the World Food Programme is present in those countries And clearly we have to scale up whenever there is a crisis. But in between times, we're trying to provide the kind of backup, if you like, for people to build up a resilience against these shocks, which appear to be happening all the more frequently. In other words, one of the biggest difficulties that we're now facing is that they haven't had enough time to recover from the previous shock of 2010. And therefore, the work that we've been doing in the meantime to support people, either through cash or food transfers to help them build up their resilience, is very, very important. But we need the international community to help us to do that with funding. Otherwise, it's just once again the emergency aid.
Caroline Hurford, thank you very much for talking to Think Africa Press.